much in the chat, I guess. It is open to all panelists and attendees, so like everyone at this time, but if it gets too like cluttered or something, I'll just make it panelists only. So that's bad, thank you. Alrighty. Okay, so during this presentation, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature. Or raise your hand. I don't know if you can raise your hand in this, and I don't know how to check if someone is raising their hand, but like feel free to do any of that. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about pedigrees, and this is actually one of the more interesting, I guess, parts of heredity. And I guess I kind of like them. They're kind of fun if you get used to it, but at the same time, they're really annoying. So, okay. First of all, I'm going to do a short review of the lesson from week 1 because it's kind of pertinent to what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so during week 1, I was mostly talking about like the law of dominance and how the alleles work. So like the most basic genetic stuff there is. So as a reminder, alleles are the different forms or versions of a gene, and they're represented by letters. Capital letters would be the dominant allele, and lowercase letters would be the recessive allele. So dominant alleles match recessive ones, which is the law of dominance. When I taught like this class originally, like the first lesson, someone asked like, what does dominant mean and what does recessive mean? So if you don't really know what dominant and recessive mean, I guess one way you could think of it is like dominant alleles are more important. So whenever they appear, you're going to listen to them, and like that's what's going to show up. Kind of. It's a little confusing, but it's like the only way I can explain it. And then homozygous dominant or recessive, so just like homozygous in general, means that there are two identical alleles, you know, homo meaning like identical, same, that kind of thing. And the other, I guess, option, category thing is heterozygous, which means there are two different alleles. And again, hetero means like different, so that is like how you could see it. So homo, heterozygous. And over here, so these two would both be homozygous. This one is dominant because obviously it's capital letters, and this one is recessive because lowercase letters. But this one would be heterozygous because it is both a capital letter and a lowercase letter. So when you have a heterozygous or a homozygous dominant like genotype, which is like the letters, that means you're going to have the dominant trait. So you can see that this one right here, and that's not a good circle. Okay, this one over here and this one over here, they're both tall, which is the dominant trait. But this one over here is short, which is the recessive trait, because it is homozygous recessive. Okay. And recap of Punnett squares. These are used to show the possible outcomes of offspring. They're going to come up a lot more, not necessarily in this presentation, but if you were ever to do pedigrees like elsewhere, they would come up because they're very common to like check things, whatever. So you place the two alleles, well, not alleles, you place the genotype of the parents on the sides over here, and then you kind of multiply the different alleles to get like the offsprings. You can see them right here. And so genotype would be the genetic makeup, which are these like actual letters right here, but a phenotype would be the physical characteristics, which would be like tall, red, or shiny, just the actual characteristic. And where's the clear? Oh, here it is. So I think that's everything for a recap. Any questions on like the recap so far? No? Alrighty. Okay, so on to the main portion of this class, which is going to be pedigrees. So first of all, I have kind of like a image of a pedigree. And the first thing you might notice is that it looks kind of like a family tree. And you would be correct. Pedigrees are kind of like family trees, but they're used to track specific diseases or traits within like a family. So first of all, we have, oh, I have a chat message. Yeah, they look kind of overwhelming at first, but once you like break it down a bit, it gets a little easier. First of all, we have like the generations. So 1 obviously is the oldest generation, then 2, then 3, then 4. So the reason we label the different generations is because if we're talking about a specific individual, just say like this one right here, we would write it as 2, 4. And then we would know that we're talking about this person right here, whoever they are. And I have like a key on the next page, which talks more about like what these different symbols mean. But you can see here that it's kind of just like a family tree. You have like the different people who are married together and then their children and so on. And this is just like used to track specific traits. Another chat message. Oh, those are Roman numerals. So let me write again. This means 1, 2, 3, 4. We use Roman numerals because if we wrote like 2, 2, it could get a little confusing. I mean, I really would get confused, but like that's just how I've seen it done. Maybe it's done like with an actual number sometimes, but these are just Roman numerals. So, oh yeah, I'll talk about why some are black on the next slide, but these are just Roman numerals. So if you're curious about that, feel free to like search up as a void. Anyway, so this is where we get to why some of them are black and why some of them are white. So this is like the key or legend. Like if you see something on a map, there's usually like a key in the corner that tells you like, oh, a star is a capital and something like that. So that is what this is. So the reason I separated these two, that's a bad circle. These two like white shapes is because all squares are male and all circles are female. So that is what that means. And if they are white or blank, that means they are unaffected. So they don't have whatever trait or disease that you're tracking with the pedigree. However, if they are black or shaded, sometimes they use like different colors. They'll probably put it in the corner somewhere. Cause like I've seen pedigrees where they use like purple and yellow. They just want to. It's just like they'll have it in the corner then. But most times if you have a white one, a white shape, they're unaffected. And if it's shaded with some kind of color, they're affected. So that means they have whatever trait or disease we're tracking. For example, color blindness or something. And if it is half shaded, that means they are a carrier. And in this case, that means they are heterozygous because they carry the recessive allele. This only applies to when the trait we're tracking is recessive, because if it was dominant, then they're really, I guess, not that big of a point. Actually, there would be a point. Okay, never mind. Just know that carriers are heterozygous. So for example, let's say whatever trait we're tracking, the alleles are H and H. So we could say that this person, oh, let's also say it's recessive, just why not? We could say that this person might be heterozygous. Oh wait, no, they're not heterozygous. This person is homozygous, and this person is heterozygous. However, sometimes in some pedigrees, they will not mark like the carriers, or they will not shade anything partially, because sometimes they want you to find that yourself. But just know that they do exist. Sometimes it might be a carrier, but they'll just be like completely unaffected or completely shaded or something, depending on like the inheritance pattern. Just know that carriers do exist. Sometimes they won't mark it, sometimes they will. And carriers are very important because that leads to why sometimes we see like an entire row of unaffected people, but suddenly we do see someone who's affected like later down the line. And if we have a line in between two shapes, that means they're married. And then like a third line down here means they're a child. If there's multiple children, it'll bracket off into something like that. And then we'll have more children, something like that. There are a lot more symbols, and it actually came up in a test once and we were so confused. But there are a lot more symbols. These are just like the most basic ones. There's ones for like if you don't know who the child, what gender someone is, or if someone was adopted, if it was that one person was like the first time the trait was observed in this family. It can get very complicated. This is just like the most basic examples we have. Okay, so now we're going to talk about inheritance patterns, which is why I was going on about why. Let me chat message. Okay, what is the difference between affected male and female? They both affected. All right, okay, I'm going to go back to the earlier slide. Good question. I guess I wasn't very clear about that. Sorry. Okay, so I probably should talk about inheritance patterns first, but let's say the trait or whatever. Okay, let's do something very random. Let's do height. How about we're gonna use T. So capital T means tall, lowercase t means short. And let's just say this is recessive. So for affected people, they have to have like the recessive alleles, and that would mean they're all short. However, for carriers, they have two different alleles. So in this case, they would be tall. But so they would just be like the same thing as over here. You know, they'd be the same thing. Sometimes they will be marked differently, sometimes they won't. However, if we switch these two around and say that the lowercase t means that they are tall, no, yeah, sorry. Let's if we switch it around and say like the lowercase t makes them tall instead, and everyone else is short. Wait a minute, what am I saying? Oh, sorry. Okay, let's flip this around and say that still tall is dominant, but it is less common. So in that case, whoopsies, I just got rid of that. In that case, we could say that this is homozygous dominant, and then this person would be tall. However, they would be affected since this, we're saying that this trait is dominant. On this side, the carrier would still be heterozygous, but now these two, that's a long line, these two are the same instead of these two. So sometimes they are the same, sometimes they're different. Does that make slightly more sense? Can the affected human be tall or short? Well, what do you mean? It's so confusing. Are you talking about like, is it possible for them to be tall or short? Okay, so the thing is, I made up a random scenario. I'm just saying like, what if the genes for height, it doesn't actually work like this. So don't listen to this. It doesn't actually work like this. I just came up with a random example just to illustrate like how it would work if you were passing it down and how these different symbols represent that. Does that make more sense? Okay, maybe. All right, okay, great. I'm sorry. This is very confusing, but later on it'll probably get more, I guess, understandable when we talk about inheritance patterns. Okay, on to inheritance patterns. This is why I was prattling on about if something was dominant, or if it was like assuming something was dominant or assuming something was recessive, and how that would like affect it differently. So autosomal means body cells. So I have like a chart diagram thing. This is called a karyotype. I'll talk more about that next week because that's next week's lesson plan. But so in every cell we have 46 chromosomes, at least in body cells. So that would be cells like hair, skin, that kind of stuff. And autosomal means body cells. So if we have some trait or I guess disease that is autosomal, dominant, recessive, it would be on one of these 22 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, so at the bottom here, we can see there is a X chromosome and a Y chromosome. And these are special because they're there's sex chromosomes. So we know, you might not know, but okay, so a male will have X and a Y that like codes for it. And for females, we have two X's. So these are special. And for autosomal, it just means that the trait will be like the gene itself will be somewhere on one of these chromosomes. I'm just like selecting random places, but they'll be on one of these 1 through 22. They'll be somewhere on there. However, gametes are the reproductive cells, so sperm in males and eggs in females. And they're special because they only have 23 chromosomes. And that is because we get half of our DNA from each parent. But anyway, so the inheritance patterns underneath these would be X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive, and Y-linked. So for X-linked, the trait would be somewhere on this X chromosome right here, and the Y-linked trait would be just like sitting somewhere on the Y chromosome. And it's called linked because it is like on that chromosome. So it is like related to that chromosome, which is why I call it linked. Any questions? Hopefully that made sense. I'll go into each of the inheritance patterns separately on the next however many slides there are. There's one. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So again, autosomal cells are body cells, And if we say something is autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive, the trait will be on one of these 22 pairs of chromosomes, so one of the 44. And for something that is X-linked or Y-linked, we have a question. What are chromosomes? Oh, I'm going to explain that. Okay, sorry. So chromosomes are very tightly wound up, like just like very tightly wound up DNA. So last week I talked about DNA, but and I said like there was so much DNA that if you took one cell, you spread out all the DNA, it would be 2 meters long, which is like 6.5 feet, maybe. I can't math. So that is why there are chromosomes, because if you have that much DNA, it's really hard to store inside like such a tiny cell. So chromosomes are very, very tightly wound and packed like bundles of DNA. And it's the DNA. They just like sit in the nucleus and code for stuff. I'll talk about chromosomes a bit more next class because that is like the actual, that's what pertains to it. All right, moving on. Okay, so first we're talking about autosomal dominant. I'm just going in order of what I put on the previous slide. So autosomal dominant, again, this means that it is on one of the 44 non-sex chromosomes, and in this case, it is dominant. So just because it is dominant, we can kind of assume that would be rather common because if it's dominant, it's usually more common. For example, this is not like autosomal dominant because it's a lot more complicated, but hair color, darker hair colors are more dominant than lighter hair colors. So darker hair colors are usually more common in like most parts of the world. There are some exceptions because like all the people stay around. But anyway, so autosomal dominant traits cannot skip generations. So this just means that we have our 3 generations, right? We have 1, 2, and 3, and that just means there is going to be at least one person in every generation that has this trait because it is dominant, and it affects males and females equally. So we can see here we have 3 females and 3 males that are affected. Obviously the ratio isn't always going to be exactly perfect because, like, for example, if you took a coin, you flipped it 100 times, it's not going to be exactly 50 tails and 50 heads. It's just like around there, theoretically. So later on, I'll get into how we can check whether something is autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive. Just know that it cannot skip generations. This one was kind of hard for me to understand because sometimes we'll have like someone who married someone else who does not have the trait, and they're like recessive. They have like a recessive genotype, and then it just never appears again. And that is kind of like a special case. But that was like kind of like branching off into the family. It doesn't really count. So just like as a disclaimer, these rules, or I guess tips, are supposed to be there to like kind of guide you towards thinking a certain way, because if you just look at a pedigree, it can get very complicated because you don't even know where to start. So these rules are kind of here so that you start thinking in a certain direction. All right, next is autosomal recessive. So first of all, rather rare. You can see we only have 2 people who actually have this in this pedigree, and this can skip generations. And it doesn't really skip one in here, but for example, if we had like these 2 parents, unaffected parents, and then they had a unaffected child who married another unaffected person, and then they had a child who suddenly did have the recessive trait. Well, my drawing is really bad. That would be called skipping generations because starting from this generation, okay, actually, if this person were affected, it also wouldn't make a difference because it can get kind of dicey later on. But skipping generations would just be, so one person is affected here, nobody's affected here, but suddenly one person is affected again here. And that's because it's recessive. So if I were to like illustrate it using the genotypes, I'm just going to use the letter R if I can move this thing out of the way. Oh, wait, someone raised their hand. Nobody raised their hand? I'm so confused. Okay, never mind. Okay, so if I were to use just like the letter R as an example, this person would be recessive because this, like, I'm assuming this entire thing is autosomal recessive. And I can just say that this person is heterozygous. I don't know that they are heterozygous per se, but this is just an example. So I'm going to assume this person's heterozygous. So using a Punnett square, which I'm not going to draw out because my handwriting is not that great, but using a Punnett square, you could actually draw it out if you wanted to. We know that this child being heterozygous is a possibility. And then they could marry someone who is also heterozygous. And then that is how this trait would appear again in the third generation. So that is what I mean by it can skip generations. Again, it can get kind of confusing sometimes because sometimes if like someone marries someone else or something, it looks like they skipped a generation or something, but it didn't really. So again, take these tricks with a grain of salt. They're just here to help you think in a certain direction. And lastly, it affects males and females equally. So we see we have one male and one female. Again, it's very subjective. Theoretically, it would be a perfect number of males and females, and they would be perfectly. Well, what is heterozygous and what is homozygous? Okay, since this is anonymous, maybe you weren't here at the beginning of the class, but I'm going to go back all the way to the beginning, actually. Where is the go back option? Technical difficulties, wait a moment. Oh, okay, so I explained homozygous and heterozygous as at the beginning as a recap from week 1. So homozygous means that they have two identical alleles. So that would be this plant right here and this plant right here. While heterozygous means that they have two different alleles, which is right here. You can think of homo, which means same or identical. So homozygous, identical, and hetero meaning different. Hetero, different, like two different alleles, and or two identical alleles. And yeah, that's about it. I guess additionally, sometimes homozygous is called purebred and sometimes heterozygous is called hybrid. It might help you to remember it a bit more because they're less like scientific, sciencey terms, I guess. And like you think purebred, maybe that one's a little more convoluted, but you think hybrid and you think, oh, two different things mixing together, kind of. They're not really mixing, but you get what I mean. Okay, anyway, back to slide 10. Yeah, that's what we're on. Okay, let me clear these interfaces. Okay, anyway. So like I was saying, ideally it would affect males and females equally, but of course, it's not always perfect. Oh, one thing I neglected to mention, when we see a pedigree, within each generation, the people are ordered from oldest to youngest. So you can tell that this person, 1-1, is older than 1-2. And if we were looking at like the children, this person is the oldest, while this person is the youngest. So they're just ordered left to right from oldest to youngest. Okay. Now we're moving on to X-linked. So these are a little more complicated because they are linked to a specific chromosome, and because not all humans have the same chromosomes, like the same X or Y chromosomes, it gets a little more complicated. Because while we all have the 1 through 22 pairs of chromosomes, some people have XX and some people have XY, or another mutation, which I'll get into next week. But that is why this is slightly more complicated. So if we have something that's X-linked dominant, rather common. Again, it's dominant. But something to notice is that an affected father will pass the trait onto all of their daughters. And that is because, again, males have 1 X chromosome while females have 2. So if a father is affected, let's just say it's an A, while a mother is not affected, or if a mother is affected, it wouldn't make a difference because as long as there is 1 dominant allele, whoever the offspring is going to have the dominant trait. So the father will pass it on to, affected fathers will pass it on to all of their daughters. So you can see this father right here, pass it on to every one of their 4 daughters. Oh wait, not this one. Sorry, wait a minute. This one's not a daughter. Sorry, I got confused. Okay, so he passed it on to his 3 daughters, while this male here did not have it. And it should affect males and females somewhat equally. Again, it's not perfect, but because it is X-linked dominant, it should affect females and males somewhat equally. I guess I'll like start write out a few genotypes just to illustrate an idea of how it might work. So for this one, obviously they're affected, which I wrote earlier. So we write it like the trait as an exponent or as a superscript, if you know it like that, because it is linked to that specific chromosome. You know. Okay, so this person, since they're not affected, we know they have the recessive trait because this is X-linked dominant. And that means this child would either be, oh wait, no, they have to be heterozygous, sorry. Oh, what? My handwriting is not really great. Okay. So I hope you kind of get the idea. You would use a Punnett squared cross it, which I think I have a slide on later on. But the reason why these males or the sons don't have it is because the mother doesn't have the trait, which will make sense on this slide. All right, X-linked recessive. Okay, so recessive, rather rare, sort of rare. It can skip generations because it is recessive. And this one affects males more often. And I'll get into that on the next slide. It's rather interesting because obviously you'd think like X-linked, shouldn't females be more affected since like we have two X chromosomes? But no, I'll get into that on the next slide. Anyway, affected fathers do not pass the trait on to their sons. So if you see an affected father, let's pretend this is affected, and you see that their son has the trait, you can like rule out X-linked recessive. Okay, so next slide, which is where stuff gets interesting. So why do X-linked traits affect why do X-linked recessive traits affect males more often? And it is because males only have one X chromosome. So if they inherit the recessive gene from the mother, they will have that trait. It's kind of like dominant. It's kind of like dominant traits. I said like as long as you have one dominant trait, you will express, one dominant allele, you'll express the dominant trait. It is similar to that, except in this case, you only have one X chromosome. So whatever you get from the mother, that's what trait you're going to get. Because obviously for sons, the father will pass down the Y chromosome while the mother passes down the X one. So if the mother happens to pass down a recessive gene, that's what they're going to get. However, females have two X chromosomes, so they need two copies of the gene, of the recessive gene. And that's why it's kind of like a safety, kind of like a backup, I guess. It's like a cover. So I have a Punnett square over here, which hopefully illustrates, I'm gonna erase this one, which hopefully illustrates some of like a lot of the different possibilities. So let's take a look at the male, the sons of this cross first, possible sons. And obviously these are the ones with the Y chromosome. Nothing is linked to the Y chromosome because this is an X-linked recessive trait, so Y chromosome doesn't matter. Okay, so this mother is heterozygous dominant, and she does, not heterozygous dominant, she's just heterozygous. So she doesn't have the trait because our trait is X-linked recessive. However, the father does have this trait, and we'll see why later. I kind of chose that because it illustrates my point pretty well. Okay, so taking a look at the two sons, this first one right here, he got the dominant allele from the mother, which means he was lucky or unlucky. Sometimes these traits are good, sometimes they're bad. Most of the times they're bad. So he was lucky enough that he didn't get affected by this trait. However, with this son over here, the only chromosome that he got from his mother, not the only chromosome, but like the gene he got from his mother is the recessive one. So that means he's automatically going to get it. There's no backup, there's no safety, there's no second chances. However, with the daughter over here, one daughter, this you can see there's two X chromosomes, so it's a female. You can see that while they do have a recessive allele from the father, they technically have like a second chance because the mother passed on the dominant allele. However, for this daughter right here, she does have the trait because she has two recessive ones. So like her backup didn't work, her safety plan didn't work, you know. That's kind of why X-linked recessive traits will affect males more often because they do not have like a backup plan or a safety or a cover or something like that. They don't have a second chance. And it's really interesting. It comes up in quite a few tests. There's a lot of tests that ask like, well, why do these traits affect males more often? And it's actually really interesting to look into. All right, so lastly, Y-linked. And these are rare, but not in like it's rare on the pedigree, but rare as in very few traits are Y-linked. I can't remember any off the top of my head, but they just like never come up. And that is because there are so few traits that are actually Y-linked. So this means all males are affected. And there is no dominant, Y-linked dominant or Y-linked recessive because there's just like one Y chromosome. And so there's no point because like it's kind of like passing on an X-linked recessive allele to a son. You're just gonna get it. There's no backup. There's no safety. And we can see here that these two men don't have, or males, I don't know how old they are. They don't have the trait, even though I said all males are affected. And that's because this person's from like an external family. You can see he was married into the family. He wasn't originally part of this family tree. And obviously the female's not affected, so their son's not going to be affected. And you can see like all the males from the original family are affected, like these people. This father right here passed on to his two sons, while this son right here passed on to his two sons, which are right here. However, the father didn't pass it on to the daughter right here because he can't, physically can't. So from that original family, it's not getting passed on anymore, at least for like this part here. So Y-linked, it comes up very not frequently. Usually it's there as an option to like throw you off or something. I haven't seen it come up a lot. Anyway, now comes to the complicated part. And it's part of the reason why I said that pedigrees are kind of frustrating or annoying at times. And it's because sometimes it's kind of hard to identify what the inheritance pattern is. So I just talked about 5 of them, which are like the most common ones. There are probably some more very niche and very convoluted ones. Oh well. So to identify them, we use like some of the tips or trends as in like it's kind of common within the pedigrees from the previous slides, and look for some interesting or telltale signs, which I'll get into when we take a look at like this example over here. And then if all else fails, start using Punnett squares. So they can be used to check your answer. If you have extra time and you want to like check your answer, check your work, you can use Punnett squares. But if you're just like blindly guessing, it can be very time consuming, especially for complicated ones. So let's take a look at this example as an example. Okay, so I'm going to talk about like the interesting or telltale signs first. So we can see here that we have 2 affected parents, but suddenly there is an unaffected child. And that is one of the interesting trends I was talking about. So seeing this, we can tell that like the only possibility would be that this is somehow, these parents are both heterozygous, which means that the inheritance pattern is something dominant. Okay, wait. With this one, you will notice that like technically there are more unaffected people than affected people, even though I said it was dominant. And that's because like, wait, I have a chat message. Oh yeah, that's a Punnett square. Very nice. You learned something. Okay. Yeah, that would be a Punnett square, and that is like exactly what might have happened here. So this person obviously has like well, we don't know if it's a T, but I did use T earlier. So we know that this person is homozygous recessive, while these 3 children over here, they could be heterozygous or homozygous dominant. We don't really know. And frankly, it doesn't matter because it doesn't continue on anymore. Okay. Back to what I was saying. So a lot of these are recessive, and that is because this recessive, well, a lot of these people are unaffected. It's because this unaffected person here went and married another unaffected person, and since we know it's something dominant, all their children are not gonna have the trait. For example, if we had like a Punnett square, and we put like the recessive traits on the sides, you can tell that all of them are just going to be like the same thing as the parents, which is why we have such like a large portion, I guess, of unaffected people. I don't really get rid of all of them. Okay, so yeah, this is the most telltale sign. So next, let's take a look at how many males and females are affected. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 females and 1, 2, 3 males. So pretty even. Nothing else we can really glean from there. And from here, I would start using Punnett squares to check how it could be inherited. So at this point, we know it's going to be something dominant. So dominant. We just don't know if it's going to be autosomal dominant or X-linked dominant. And so this is at the point where we would start using Punnett squares. And it's a lot easier on paper because you can actually like write it out, or you just like, if you get used to using Punnett squares, especially for this kind of thing, because it's kind of simple, you can start doing it in your head. But for now, I'll use an example. Okay, so let's assume it's X-linked dominant first. So if we're checking something, or if we're just like blindly guessing, we assume something first and we try to like fit it into this category. Okay, hopefully this works. Okay, so we know that first of all, this person over here, she does have the trait. But since she has some unaffected children, we know she's heterozygous. So assuming it's X-linked dominant, maybe it's not, maybe it is, then we can tell that this person is that. Well, like that. Okay. Wait. I kind of regret this. Okay. So it is possible. Okay. Okay, all right, I will not regret this. Okay, so here we have reached the interesting part, or the telltale part. So earlier I said that both of these parents are heterozygous, which you can, well, not both of them are, you know what, both of them are affected, but for some reason they have an unaffected child, which you can tell like either they're heterozygous or the mom is heterozygous and that is like affected. We're assuming this is X-linked at the moment, which is why this person right here disproves that theory. So it is not actually X-linked dominant. And that is because, I'm going to draw a Punnett square to make it more clear. Okay, so the mother is heterozygous, while the father just has the dominant trait because there is no possibility for heterozygous. So we're just going to look at the first row right here because we're looking at a daughter. So you can see that both, wow, my handwriting is not great. Okay, both possibilities are the dominant trait, which means she would be affected. However, she's not affected in this case, which tells us that she is not then the parent that is affected born because her ancestors are affected. No. Okay, so what I did earlier, and can I undo clearing everything? Oh, I can't undo it, clearing everything. So I wrote out some like possibilities, ignoring all of the unaffected ones because we know that it's going to be something like that or this. So I'm just ignoring the unaffected ones and only looking at the affected ones because that is where like all the interesting stuff happens. So I don't understand the question. I don't really understand the question, unfortunately. Okay, so yeah, her ancestors are unaffected, which like means she carries the unaffected gene, if that makes sense. So in this case, we can tell that this inheritance pattern is not X-linked dominant, which means that it has to be autosomal dominant. And if we were to check, earlier I said these are both heterozygous because that's the only way they can have a unaffected child. And in this case, it works because with autosomal inheritance patterns, it does not really matter what gender they are. However, with X-linked something or Y-linked, it does matter. Anyway, yeah, it's autosomal dominant. Hopefully that made sense. Okay, so I have a practice problem on here, but we are running out of time, so I'm just gonna walk you through it. Okay, so first of all, first things you notice, there are very few. There's not a lot of people that are affected by this trait, and so we can probably assume it is recessive, and also males and females are equally affected, kind of, which means that it's probably not linked to the X chromosome. Why did I draw that? No. Okay, so it is, wait, what? Sorry, it's not autosomal dominant. I wrote this wrong. It's autosomal recessive. Don't listen to me. Sorry. I think I just copy and pasted from the previous slide and then I forgot to change it. I'll change it later. But anyway, so since it affects males and females equally, it's most likely autosomal, and since it is rather rare, it's most likely recessive. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to go like in depth on it, but if you really wanted to, you could like check by using Punnett Squares and coming up with like random phenotypes. Not random, but sometimes you don't really know whether someone is heterozygous or homozygous, so which is why you have to like think about like multiple possibilities. And that is why it gets really complicated and time consuming sometimes, because you have to like go through multiple possibilities. Anyway, so I'm going to go through this as fast as I can. So some common examples or common diseases or traits that are traced using pedigrees. I added this mostly for fun because it's kind of interesting to see what kind of things can be traced using these pedigrees. So autosomal dominant, there is achondroplasia, which is abnormal body proportion. So very short arms and legs, while the torso is normal size. Huntington's disease, you might have heard of this one. It's when nerve cells in the brain break down over time. It typically starts in a person's 30s or 40s, and then there's like some brain problems. Marfan syndrome is, by the way, these aren't like all of them, all of the diseases, obviously. It's just like some common ones or ones that I thought were kind of interesting. So Marfan syndrome affects the connective tissues that strengthens and stabilizes joints and muscles. And some symptoms of this, I guess, are that people will have like very long fingers. They'll have some like heart problems or intellectual disabilities, and they'll also be really tall. And lastly, Tourette syndrome. You might have heard of this one. If you're in Michael Bailey. And usually it's depicted in media kind of incorrectly, but Tourette syndrome is when someone makes like rapid, repetitive sounds and or movements that they can't control, and these are called tics. Usually in popular media, it's represented by someone who just like swears nonstop, but that is incorrect. Some people do that, but it's more than just like swearing a lot. So just don't trust the media. And then we have autosomal recessive. So albinism, I don't know how to pronounce it, means that they have very little or no melanin. Melanin is like the pigment that colors your skin, eyes, and hair. So people with albinism have very pale skin, white hair, and red eyes, like bunnies. Cystic fibrosis, or CF, and this is when mucus fills up the lungs, air ducts, and other passageways, which makes it very difficult to breathe. This mucus would include stuff like digestive fluids or saliva and something else that I forgot. Just like fluids within the body, and then they like kind of fill up the lungs, make it hard to breathe. Yeah, time's up. Sorry about that. I'll go over time by maybe 2 minutes. I'm almost done, I promise. Okay, then sickle cell anemia. That is when red blood cells become a sickle shape and start breaking down. So red blood cells, normally circle, they become a sickle. So like that, kind of. And it can cause a lot of pain. So it's not a fun thing. However, people with sickle cell anemia are immune to malaria, but it's very painful. So I would not wish that on anyone. And lastly, Tay-Sachs disease. It leads to the premature death of young children because it destroys like the nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord. It's more prominent in Jewish people because like the mutation is in like a gene that Jewish people carry. And X-linked dominant, there's not a lot, but Fragile X syndrome, which causes intellectual disability. However, symptoms are generally milder in females. And hypertrichosis, I thought this one was interesting. It's excessive hair growth, like a lot of hair growth. If you search up a picture, it's like, I don't want to be mean, but they really do have a lot of hair. And less X-linked recessive, I think this is the last slide, so hopefully we can get this done. Yeah, Tay-Sachs disease is very fatal. It's very sad because usually children will live up to like around 5 years. It's very sad. So X-linked recessive, we have DMD, or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it is progressive muscular weakness. And females are usually carriers because, again, this is X-linked recessive, and they can be mildly affected, but not much. Hemophilia, which is when the blood doesn't clot properly, which leads to excessive bleeding. So when you get injured or you get cut somewhere, the blood clots will come and like stop the bleeding, sort of minimize the bleeding, and they'll like eventually scab over or something. But for people with hemophilia, blood doesn't do that, so they just like keep bleeding. A famous example of this would be Prince Alexei Romanov, if I'm pronouncing that right, who was Anastasia Romanov's brother. He was like miraculously cured by Gregory Rasputin, but I don't know if that really worked. And lastly, red-green color blindness. So this is when you are unable to distinguish between red and green. Mark Zuckerberg, who is the founder of Facebook, was actually, yeah, it's bad if you're looking at a traffic light, but it's like bottom to top, right? If they get used to that, maybe. So Mark Zuckerberg is actually red-green colorblind, which is why he made like the Facebook logo blue. It's just like random facts for the day, I guess. And that is it. Sorry to me for going over time, but if you have any questions, feel free to email me. No homework for this week because it's kind of complicated. But does anyone have any questions before I leave? Did I stop? No.